It gives me pleasure to invite Shelley Carroll and Kent Park from Wolpert to the stage here. And we're going to talk about some elevation derived hydro up the creek with many paddles. I'm looking forward to hearing how we get paddles into this. I think Chris will catch his ear too, another fellow paddler. All right, thank you.
I would be remiss if I also didn't mention Sam Moffett, who is also here and a colleague of mine from Wolpert. So thanks for having us today. I see Sam waving from the background. Both online and in person, we have token prizes. So there will be quiz questions throughout our next half hour, 45 minutes. They're not difficult. If you have an answer or even think you might have an answer, you could win some Minnesota hand harvested wild rice or some maple syrup. So I encourage you to participate. All right, so a little about me. I know many of you, even though many of you may not know who I am. So Shelley Carroll, I was GIS coordinator for state of Minnesota for 15 years. I know Dan, I know Blaine, I know Emily, and I've heard of many of your names throughout the work that I've done. Prior to being with the Minnesota DNR for 15 years, I also worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was one of the GIS coordinators that helped build out the capabilities of our national refuge system. So what brought me to Wolpert a few years ago was the availability of resources to be able to marry two of my favorite things, aerial acquisition and natural resource management, specifically elevation derived hydrography. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to try and dial this in to make sure that it is of value to you, a very savvy audience. We can run the gamut of talking about things very basic with EDH, but I think you are at the higher end of the spectrum of knowledge. And so we'll make sure that I'm giving you a sneak peek into the technical side of things that hopefully will help you make your decisions as agency makers as you go along your way. There we go. All right, so we're going to do a very brief recap at the beginning. EDH, why the buzz? And after that, we'll move into some considerations if your state or your organization is thinking about elevation hydro, or maybe even is already dabbling in it. I'm guessing there's an awful lot of pilot projects out there. We heard about Wisconsin being one. I know that Wolpert as an organization is not alone in having both Alaska and CONUS or continental US experience. And I'm guessing that many of your universities and maybe even of your recent hires have had some hand in what's going on with elevation derived hydro. All right, so what makes EDH special? Really, there's a couple of different things. First of all, it is 3D. We're not only talking about where surface water is on the landscape from an X and a Y position, but we're talking about it from the Z position, right? What is the elevation of that itself? We're talking about monotonicity, right? And that means that water is flowing downhill. All of the things within the EDH data set need to be connected. And that means that wherever a raindrop falls within an EDH data set that is geography covered, that you're able to trace both the downstream and the upstream impacts of that particular raster cell throughout the entire data set of that hydro network. Now, there's several things that can be connected to surface water. We all know about groundwater. We all know about engineered environments. We've talked briefly today about NWI, National Wetlands Inventory. There are a few other elements as we go along our EDH journey that together form what we're calling the Internet of Water. And there are regional stations, regional centers of excellence throughout the US, some in universities, some in federal agencies, some at state organizations that are helping form what we consider this entire context of how we're managing water, not only here in the US, but beyond. I'd also like to say that some data sets that you may have out there for hydro now are probably versioned, right? You've had things over time evolve, your data has become more granular, it has become better attributed, perhaps it is now connected. In most cases, however, it may not be directional. So the last several years has really been a good focus nationwide on how water is flowing. And not just the fact of what is connected from one to another, but the fact of which way it's going. And again, that's all about traceability. If we're going to have the ability to model the hydraulic or the hydrologic aspects of the landscape, we've got to make sure that that water is flowing the direction that we intended to go from a digital standpoint. So we all have heard about the READ rules and the acquisition specs. So the guidebook of producing elevation-derived hydro is really a forerunner from the USGS. 2 documents that help concern how we're going to be able to generate that data, edit that data, and then conflate that data back into the national archives. And of course, watershed boundaries is another piece of that. It's a piece that's gotten less recognition in the last several years, but for those of you who are maybe on the bleeding edge or the front running edge of developing EDH, we're coming to realize more and more how important it is to have the watershed boundaries derived or developed at the same time that we've got the hydro that is being developed. All right, so I've got Kent and Sam in the back with prizes. Now this goes for online folks too. Let's go to a quick question. So what makes EDH different from traditional hydrography? Any answer wins you a prize. I heard 3D.
Made from a DEM.
Made from a DEM. Oh man, all right. We might have to give out 2 prizes right away, Sam and Kent. Raise your hands if you got the prize. All right, so here's a sneak peek in the secret sauce of hydro. Again, my apologies if you already know the workflow of how the sausage is being made, but look at the front end of the workflow. The gray is the preparation work, right? And as you'll notice, that is more than 1/3 of the total number of steps to get to elevation-derived hydro. And the gray boxes we are finding are more and more important. So I think maybe a decade ago, maybe even 12 or 13 years ago, with many states starting through the 3-DEP program or even before then to get elevation data through LIDAR, there was dabbling going on, right? We know if we've got elevation data, we should be able to come up with better hydro. And we didn't pay much attention to those gray boxes up front. We thought we've got LIDAR, we can generate lines, we'll just brush those up and turn them into a data set. And what we've come to find out is that in non-engineered environments, right, rugged rural Alaska, perhaps that works out okay. But everything else is going to have some care and feeding on the front end in order to have the computer be able to derive where the water is actually flowing on the landscape. And so we found here at Wolpert and many of our clients as well, that it's actually an iterative process to get through those gray boxes to get to the middle, the meat and potatoes of actually editing, attributing, making sure that things are monotonic and directional. You'll notice the green circles in the slide. Those are places where watershed boundaries fit into that workflow. So as we talk about originally, we were just talking EDH. Now we're realizing that things like wetland inventory and watershed boundaries are just as important and they all play together. Here, at least in this slide, you're seeing where the green, the watershed, does come into play. We're actually developing the watershed boundaries in conjunction with deriving those lines, those blue lines. And again, as we're going through the process of using LIDAR and other inputs to do that, we're finding that the fine tuning, the parameters, those gray areas that we're preparing the LIDAR data before we do the elevation derivatives is what makes all the difference. And then, of course, there's the whole quality control, the acceptance, and the conflation part. How many of you have ever conflated either surface water or watershed boundaries to the USGS's national data sets? Probably a good thing. There's a lot of pain involved, a lot of time involved. Although it seems like a fairly regular process, right? The data has already been brushed up. It's ready to go. It's been stamp of approval. We find that the actual ingestion into the National Hydrography data set, so the NHD, or the watershed boundary data set, the WBD, can sometimes be very time-consuming processes. USGS is working to improve the tools in order to conflate that data, But as you well know, the wait sometimes between when data is QC'd and when it's available for your use or for public use is too painful. And so being able to make sure that we keep the same version of data that you have submitted and that everyone is able to get to at the same time is really important. All right, so geomorphons or geomorphic indicators. Can I get a show of hands? Anybody familiar with this term? All right, so this is the backbone, in addition to the LiDAR data, of how the computer algorithms are generating the streams, rivers, and water bodies. So in general, this started maybe 15, 20 years ago. There have been about 36 different algorithms that help define where water is going to go on a landscape. And it basically is taking the cell, 1 pixel of whatever raster data you're working with, and trying to determine when those cells are put together in certain sizes or combinations, where the water is going to go. You can see from this picture here that there are 10 basic ways that water can flow or that a landscape is characterized. And most of those 3 or so dozen algorithms that help produce the blue lines on the map are based somewhat, if not all, on these 10 categories. So here's a quick example. Start out in Alaska. This was Wolpert's first USGS pilot data. Very rugged area of central Alaska, but not only had high relief, then ended up going into very low relief, the Yukon Delta, right? So kind of a mashup of everything. Try to find the best and worst of developing hydro. And you'll see that in our sample data set, the yellow area, the red circle around it, we get into a bit more finer detail of what I'll show you. So geomorphic indicators, we found that about 7 of the 36 or so available worked really well for the type of landscape where we're looking at. And on the screen, you see 3 different kinds of GMIs or geomorphic indicators that we found worked well. And you'll see that they all show a different thing. So on the left-hand side, the geomorphons, GMI, actually showed in red where there were ridges and water should not cross over, and in blue, the most likely places where water would flow. In the middle is what we call an openness index. And that, again, is another way of indicating where the major flows are throughout a landscape. And finally, you'll see the curvature. That particular GMI is very good at teasing out the less prominent streams, right? The headwaters, the smaller flows as they go. And a combination of these 3 plus 4 more was how we were able to check the work of the computer algorithms as they generated the lines and then perform QC on the data. All right, question number 2, and I'm not sure, perhaps Jamie, we can see if there's an online person who's willing to answer. So what are geomorphic indicators used for?
I'm keeping an eye.
All right, hearing nothing from our online audience. How about you out in the live audience? What are GMIs used for? Oh, did I stump us?
I don't know.
Go, Leslie, go. All right, 2 things. I'll give you one and you see if you can pick up the second one. QC and checking the computer algorithms, fine tuning them. All right, now if I ask you that question again, who wants to raise their hand and get free maple syrup? Frank over here gets it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about software. So the big mystery in elevation derived hydro is, what software are you using? What workflow are you using? And the answer is many. This is the many paddles up the creek part of the conversation. There's at least a dozen, probably more like 14, 15, even 20 different software programs that have some module or element of generating the line work, the water bodies, the GMIs, or performing the QCing, the editing, the monotonicity, and the directionality. And any combination of these particular software, as well as the methods that you're using within them, can produce myriad different solutions. Certain combinations are better for flat landscapes, certain are better for mountainous landscapes, and then there are urban landscapes as well. The urban environments are the least investigated, and for good reason, right? The low-hanging fruit is the places that are easiest to generate lines for, and those are the places where people don't live. But our real need is to find out how we're going to be able to derive hydro from around places where there are people. And you can see that from this slide that you need to make some general assumptions about how you think water flows across the landscape in order to start out your algorithms at the right step. One of the best ways you can do that is by having good hydrography data to begin with, especially things like culvert data sets. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So a third thing that's very important as you go forward in your EDH is to consider density. Now in Alaska, USGS had directed all of the contractors working on pilot projects to have lines that are 2 to 4 times as dense as the existing NHD data sets. And that really wasn't too hard to do, because if you think about it, all of the original hydro data had been developed off of paper maps, topo maps, in some cases that were 40 or even 50 years old. And so the computer generation, by just changing the dial 1 or 2 instances higher, was able to generate, in some cases, 8 to 10 times as many streams and rivers as existed on those paper maps. But what you find in the higher elevations is there's some false positives, right? Not all of those streams are really necessary, because a lot of the times those are all event driven and they're going to be ephemeral and not perennial streams. So here's an example that we have of what density looks like. This is a Red River Valley, so northwestern corner of Minnesota. This is where I cut my teeth on EDH 2011 or so. Dan knows the area well. And when folks are making decisions about EDH, one of the questions that you're going to be asked is, how dense do you want the data? So far in USGS, there's 2 separate methods or determinations of coming up with what the appropriate answer might be for your state or your organization. One is by the catchment size. So in many cases, folks are saying, well, I need to see all of the streams that are draining into a 40-acre parcel, or a 20-acre parcel, or a 5-acre parcel. A second way of determining how dense you want your data to be is through what we call the Strahler stream order. And for those of you who know hydro, there's several different ways of classifying streams as they come together from a headwaters into larger rivers and then eventually to their pour point or where they're draining to. But Strahler seems to be the sweet spot of being able to determine how many lines you want on a map. So this is an example of a Strahler stream order, and this would be 7. We're looking at approximately 20 acres here, very flat farm fields with a small river running through it. And depending on what we deal with clients who come to us wanting EDH, we show them pictures of various densities. And we say, eyeball it. Is this more of what you're looking for? We're showing them things that are twice as dense as what they've seen in their current data set, or maybe 3 or 4 times. But depending on where you're starting, the data that you start with, all depends on what the correct level of density is for you at the end. All right, so another really key point for you, a consideration going forward, is the data that you can contribute to the inputs, right? Just the algorithm alone isn't going to get you the correct accuracy of the lines that you want, or even the density that you want. We talked about iterative steps, piecing together the modules of the different software to make sure that it fits the landscapes that you're working with. And the critical piece to that is knowing if there are man-made features that help the water move across the landscape. And we're talking canals, culverts, other engineered structures. Now, USGS right now, because they are the purveyors of the standard, are still working through a lot of those final rules. In fact, even in Alaska now, we come back every few weeks where we've asked USGS a question and they may not have a direct answer for us. And in talking with other contractors, they are developing the rules as we go. And that makes sense. It's a very large field. There's an awful lot that we can't anticipate until we actually come upon it. In the engineered environment right now, you should know that USGS is basically drawing a box around places where there might be large areas of water that are engineered, right? And so it's up to us as contractors to either, number one, get the engineered water data that you may have, but more than likely end up cutting out the places where we're not deriving the hydro, specifically for large cities or very urban areas. The better data you can have to provide a contractor to be able to generate the lines, the easier, the faster, the less costly that data is going to be to produce. You can see that crosswalking and attributing your data is also really important. So most of you, I'm sure, would not like to throw out all of your hard work the last 25 years in getting your hydro data digital. In order to make sure that we are able to take the attributes of your existing data and apply it to the new data, we're going to want to work with you closely on how to crosswalk that. In many cases, we're finding because we have denser data sets, you all are going to help in the attribution of that newer data, whether that's generating a hydro line ID, maybe giving names or partial coding to the lines that have not been created before. All right, so here we have an example. This would be in Eastern Oregon, and you'll notice the red circle. So one of the ways that we check our LiDAR data and the elevation derived hydro is against ancillary data sets. The GMIs we were talking about, air photos, any local data sets you may have. And the computer is doing what it needs to do. The algorithms are trying to connect the dots of where water is most likely to flow, but that doesn't mean that it's right 100% of the time. So for instance, in the red circle you see here, that's a track of a local high school. Now, either there's a culvert in the north end and the south end of the track, and the water is flowing across the middle, but likely not. That's probably a soccer field or a football field, right? Fairly flat. And so this is an example of where we would want to have existing water data sets or be able to make sure that our QC is identifying places where perhaps the algorithm wasn't quite correct. Now, there's actually a second place I would put a red circle around this photo. Does anybody have any idea why, where I would put the circle? So if you look just south of the track, you will notice that there is a waterway that doesn't appear to be connected. And that's another place where, yep, the computer did a pretty good job, but without the input of local water data sets, the computer may have found maybe there was an anomaly in the landscape, maybe there was a building or a road without a culvert in the LiDAR data. And because of that, it knocked off course the fact that there's a river flowing all the way from the south end of the photo to the north. All right, so this should be an easier question for you. Let's see if there's any online folks, Jamie, for this answer. What are some of the ancillary data sets that we can use to help fine tune and craft the EDH that we deliver?
We do have some folks sharing here. Donovan Powers from Ohio says imagery. Mark Holmes says culverts. Thanks for participating, y'all.
All right. And would you, Jamie, write down those names? I know Donovan. I'm not sure that I know Mark, but we should probably get them some wild rice in the mail.
You got it.
All right. The last topic, something to consider again, I mentioned at the beginning, and this is becoming more important, is watershed boundaries. So again, watershed boundaries are generated as part of the process of generating the hydro line work. And although it might be a little extra money or a little extra work on the front end, the fact that you have those two things generated in concert makes them more accurate together. and clients that we have seen that have decided to only do the line work in the water bodies and not done the watershed boundaries until later, find that the watershed boundaries are something they really needed and would have been much more cost effective to produce at the same time. Here's an example again of some Alaska data that we did. You'll notice that in the black are the old watershed boundaries. The purple is the new Huck 8 or big watershed of the project area, and the blue are the new Huck 12 watershed boundaries. What's most interesting about this is you'll see that it's all occurring, or most of it occurring, in the Yukon Delta, right? Those flat areas. And as we talk about built environments or landscapes that are more flat than high relief, you're going to notice that there is more change in those watershed boundaries, just like there's likely going to be more change in the lines themselves. They were harder to depict without computer intervention. And now that we have those machine learning processes, what we come up is highly more accurate, more detailed. All right, so as a recap, considerations for EDH, you likely have all heard of these things before, but consider density, consider the method or the algorithms that are used. The geomorphic indicators become key to anything that we're doing when we're talking about EDH. Your local inputs are going to make the difference between a good data set and a great data set. And finally, watershed boundaries. Have them on your radar and make sure that they are part of what your overall deliverables are. All right, any questions from the audience? I think we have a few extra minutes.
So this has been really helpful educationally. I've been thinking about hydro and how we tackle it. And one of the big questions I had was, how do you know when to stop? So effectively, if I understood correctly, that's what you mean by density, which is you say how much detail are we going to include, and then you define what that level of detail is. And when you achieve that, you stop. So that means there are some streams that are not mapped.
That is correct, yeah. And usually as you get denser, right, the streams that you end up choosing, are they mapped or are they not? Are those ephemerals, those streams that only show channelization when a large event occurs, either a water event of some sort or a weather or terrain change. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, Rich Wooler from GPI Geospatial. I was real interested. Now you showed 8 geomorphic indicators, correct?
Oh, there are more like 3 or 4 dozen.
That was my question. I figured those were the base, but there must be dozens and dozens of other variations.
There are, thanks to many smart people doing a lot of research, an awful lot of college students, by the way. There are so many variations on a theme, I can't begin to count. However, those 14 or so software programs all start out with 3 or 4 algorithms at their base, and then they have spin-offs. The real trick is finding which combination of spin-offs work best for the environment you're working in.
Hi, this is Leslie from Alaska. So in the pilots in Alaska, they've been great. And one of the things that we've learned, and you alluded to it, is the iterative process. And we're kind of learning as we go. And in terms of like even the QC and the validation part. And as you know, in Alaska, there's also, there's not clear channels in a lot, like especially in the northern parts, right? Where it's subsurface flows. And I've been a part of a couple of sort of the reviews from the pilot data, right, where you kind of have eyes on it, and we gather the experts, right, because we want the people to actually know the landscape to provide input as part of that sort of QC process and how we validate that information. And so again, we're learning that as we go. So I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit and what Wolpert has found to be most beneficial in that process.
Sure. So I would say that someone with the ability to read that landscape, you're right, natural resource background, hydrology, hydrography background. Some of the best folks we have at Wolpert working on EDH are actually veterans. They have learned to read the landscape through their mapping, through their remote sensing skills or capabilities. And those folks have a broad or general sense of how things should be working on that landscape, but working with those scientists as well and making sure that pilot projects are really important in this. I know they're important for just about every geospatial task that we undertake, but making sure again that your local data sets and your local experts are taking a look at the data alongside of us. We do have a long way to go, Leslie, no doubt.
Jamie, is there anybody online that has questions?
Yes, we do have some questions here. I would request Phil, feel free to come off mute and turn on your camera, as well as Colleen Kiley from North Carolina. Thank you.
This is Phil Worrell. The dog is barking right now, so hopefully you won't interrupt too much. Can you speak to the need for culvert data, and by that required or optional in your workflow?
Sure. To culvert data, Phil?
Yes.
Yeah. So what we have found is that if you do not provide a contractor culvert data, we're going in and we're drawing them ourselves. So the biggest impediment to those algorithms being able to draw what they need to for the lines are things like roads or any other impediments, berms, things on the edge of a farm field, et cetera. And so it's not as important as you may think to have, the size of the culvert, the elevations at each end of the culvert. We're talking quick and dirty. Draw the line across the road where the water would be flowing underneath. So that really is the first and foremost level of detail that we would need. It's interesting through the iterative process, and it's fascinating that I used to be more on the technical side than I was on the project management side to be able to run the algorithm, the model that generates the lines. It is really apparent when you've missed a culvert, right? You can tell very quickly which corner of the map or where the area of the data was where things go wonky. And it's very easy then to zoom in, draw that new culvert, rerun the algorithm, and suddenly the lines come out beautifully. So the more of that is done up front, and that could be an army of students, maybe it's something you already have, but that certainly saves time on the processing end of how many times we generate the lines.
Hi, this is Colleen Kiley from North Carolina. And this is kind of a follow-up on Mark Holmes' comment about gathering 40,000 culverts. So what are some examples of successful ways to collect a lot of culverts?
Sure. Well, actually running those GMIs is something that anybody can do. And so we actually recommend to any of our clients that would be something that you do ahead of time, right? So you'd be able to run the GMI, be able to see where the places were perhaps against your culvert inventory where data had been missed. But you're right, it's a daunting task. Oftentimes it's not complete beyond the confines of a county or a city. It's not going to be standardized beyond that amount of time either. Even if you go across the state boundaries, things are collected differently. So the iterative process, in some cases, maybe it is easier to sit down with an army of several students to be able to hammer that out if that's not something that you have up front. Certainly, it's a much more expedient process if you have folks in the field doing that anyway. But given the circumstances, I would say that we're usually mashing up different culvert data sets, using that as our starting point and generating the lines to see where there might be trouble spots. There could also be the case where we run that initial line generation. We find places where we're not accepting the data that's been generated. And maybe we throw that back to the client themselves to say, is this something that you'd like to further the inventory of, or something that we take care of?
This is Frank from New York. You just kind of tapped on one of the themes that's going through my head. There are geospatial data which are built for and very appropriate for whatever the author built the data for. But a little bit of extra work gets it to a point where it's useful for lots of other things. And I'm thinking about the culvert inventory. In New York, the culvert inventory is captured in such a way that maintenance crews can go and find the culvert and inspect it. And it's referenced to a linear reference every 10th mile reference marker. And that's great for that business application. But a 10th mile in a hydrologic model, somebody's going to get wet that didn't expect to get wet. So that's just kind of one of those things, like the devil's in the detail. Check, yes, I've got a culvert inventory. Well, is it adequate? You know, and I think that you're kind of bringing out the importance of really evaluating the error budget and the precision that is necessary for different applications.
Mhm.
Can you discuss classification of new stream river features that you're collecting? You know,
Certainly can. Yeah. And so that is an evolving topic as well. You know, there are what are called USGS F codes. So in general, there are maybe 20 attribute fields in the National Hydrography data set. And even those are continuing to change as USGS is finding more anomalies, unique types of features in different landscapes. For instance, we used to call things connectors, pretty common term. And if we couldn't figure out how from LiDAR water drained from one place to another on the map, it was either going to be an overland connector or an underground connector. Now we have about 7 or 8 different particular names for those things themselves. We're starting to find that in continental US as well. Now, none of those FG codes that we've seen are as detailed as most of you have in your state or your county or your local data sets, right? So that's where that crosswalking becomes so important to make sure that whatever attributes we want to apply to that newly generated data then gets conflated to that national data set. And that's actually a perk for everyone, right? The more detail we can add to make sure that the data is what you need it to be, that then gets uploaded for others to use. Or in cases where you can't have those attributes shared, obviously we can make sure that doesn't happen. But in many cases, that extra work that you've done on the front end years before now pays dividends for a much bigger audience. All right, any final questions? If not, you get a few-minute break.
Jamie, is there anybody else online?
Nope, that covers it.
Thank you.
Thanks much.